So the conclusion to the initial question I asked about 2019 versus 2020. Do you need to upgrade your 2019 build and get it current to 2020 in order to compete with the best PCs out there? Well, AMD versus Nvidia. The age-old battle between graphics cards where Nvidia, at least for the last decade, has wound up on top. I recently did a 2020 build where we featured the most recent kind of intermediate components for a PC in 2020. We spent about $1,700 or so, and it turned out to be a monster of a PC. But if you recently purchased the previous generation, is it worth jumping ship or switching from Team Red to Team Green in 2020? The real question is, does the current generation AMD GPU perform equivalent to a current generation Nvidia GPU? Now, this isn't a test for temperatures or frequencies, so to speak. It's a test of real-world performance. How does somebody use their PC in a typical day? I do want to go over the 4 major components that I think will affect the scores that we'll get on these benchmark tests. So we're going to start out with the 2020 PC. What we're using here is the Ryzen 7 3800X, the MSI Evoke RTX 2070 Super. We're using 16 gigs of Corsair DDR4 3200 megahertz and an Intel 660p 1TB M.2 NVMe. With the 2019 AMD build, we're using the Ryzen 7 3700X, the MSI Mech RX 5700 XT, 16 gigs of Corsair DDR4 3200 megahertz, and 16 gigs of Alloy, a Newegg Special 3200 megahertz RAM. So combined, that's 32 gigabytes. We'll get into that in just a minute. We're also using the Intel 660p 1TB M.2 NVMe. Yes, I realize the obvious. The 2019 build does have more RAM. That being said, none of the games that I used went over 16 gigs of usage in my task manager. So I know I didn't even touch the other 16 gigs in the 2019 build unless I was in Premiere Pro, which we'll get into that at the end of the video. The tests. There are so many different games and ways to test a PC. I can't do them all, but I have chosen the most popular and some favorites of the community. Here's what I'll be using to test real-world performance. First, we're using Cinebench R20. Next, we're using Userbenchmarks. This is where they're going to be using the SSD to test performance for things like a workstation and regular desktop. So I want to throw it out there that we're using the same one for both PCs, so it's not really skewing the results. And yes, it may, with the 32 gigabytes, skew the results there, but we are primarily looking at gaming for the fact that we want to know which GPU is going to be the best and whether or not the 3700 or the 3800 is worth the money you're spending. So let's move on. Next, we're going to be testing frames per second in Fortnite, Borderlands 3, and Call of Duty Modern Warfare. Last but definitely not least, I wanted to do a Premiere Pro render. Why? Because if you tailor your build to any type of video encoding, video editing, which one's going to do more for you? Where's your money best spent? Is higher RAM better than a higher frequency CPU? So let me go ahead and break down the results. But first, I know this isn't inclusive of everybody. There's certain games that other people use that probably aren't going to be on this list. We only did 3 games, but it does put some numbers to the hardware we're using and gives us a real life scenario of how well these CPUs, GPUs, and RAM and SSD work. And I'll put my spin on it at the end. But for now, let's just look at the numbers. Let's start with Cinebench R20. Clearly, the winner is the 2020 build. Not really by much, about a 3% performance increase here, which is what we see online and with other benchmark tests, so it makes sense. Maybe the 2019 build did so well with R20 because of the extra RAM, but really this is a software that focuses heavily on core performance and not really on RAM performance, although it can be argued it does have an effect. But again, we can determine that the CPU itself is 3% better by using this metric and comparing it with online results that we see. So I'm pretty happy with that, and it is to be expected. Now moving to user benchmarks. Overall, the 2020 PC has a better CPU and GPU rating. User benchmark is a bit odd, like I said before, because they focus on single core performance and the frequency of the GPU. But that's not always real world performance. As expected, that leads to the 2020 PC being a better gaming machine at 107%, while the 2019 PC is at 103%. Seems the money was well spent for a 4% boost in performance. The 2020 PC does start to lag in desktop and workstation score, but I would assume this is primarily because of the 32 gigs of RAM in the 2019 PC, so we can safely assume that the RAM has almost no effect on gaming. Now getting into the gaming performance. Let me just say, I definitely thought this would be a clear winner-loser situation, like one GPU would take the cake even if only by a little bit, but that definitely isn't the case. If you're a Fortnite fan, stick with Nvidia. The bottom line is that in Fortnite, the Nvidia GPU handled itself really well. Now, the situation could change. My frames were all over the place with both GPUs, but clearly, at an average of 171 frames per second, the Nvidia GPU killed the AMD GPU at 148 average frames per second. That's about, what is that, 23 extra frames that we're getting here with Nvidia. Let's talk about Call of Duty just for a minute here. These two GPUs perform really well on this game and almost identical. And I would definitely encourage anyone to buy either of these GPUs if you're solely gaming first-person shooters. The 2020 build barely skips ahead with 2 extra frames per second on average, but overall it didn't hit the high note that the 2019 build did. AMD seemed to pick up a bit more overall performance in game, but how much does that really matter? Well, I'll give a real-world scenario. I have a 240 Hertz monitor, and if I wanted to tailor my graphics a bit to be able to maybe hit a 200 frames per second and let the monitor and FreeSync make up the difference, well, having that extra performance from AMD on this particular benchmark would definitely help me out. But the same could be said about Nvidia. So I'm not really saying either one is better, but I did see a bit more performance peak out of the AMD GPU, which means I will definitely be able to hit that 240 Hertz a bit better on the monitor, making my gaming more buttery smooth. At the end of the day, I'd say they both felt really smooth and ran extremely well, but this is more about numbers. So let's move on to the next game and the last game that I did for a benchmark, which is Borderlands 3. Borderlands is a graphic intensive game, and I definitely like to use it for testing a GPU because it sets the bar high, and I was shocked at what I found. When I first ran the benchmark for the 2020 Nvidia build, I was convinced that the 2019 AMD build would definitely lose. They were both on ultra settings all the way through, every single setting, and the AMD build actually won. It didn't peak as high as the Nvidia GPU, but it was way more consistent at 86.49 frames per second versus the 81.5 frames per second of the 2020 build. Nvidia even dropped frames more often on the bench test than the 2019 build, which means under load the 2019 build, the 5700 XT, seems a bit more stable for this particular game. However, the AMD build did the same exact thing in Call of Duty, so I can't say it's without fault. The last thing I really want to do is test the ability of the CPU and show that the 3700X can be as good as the 3800X at rendering video. I clearly made my point. Yes, there's more RAM in the 2019 build, but let's do the math. The extra RAM cost $70, Oloy 16 gig kit. Check it out on Newegg. Whereas the 2020 build actually costs more to put together at the end of the day. The 2070 Super alone is $80 more than the 5700 XT. That's not counting any other cost that it took to build this PC. So clearly RAM was way more effective for rendering a larger video than the CPU was. That's at least between these two CPUs. We know that the 3700X and the 3800X are very similar. So I can't say you're gonna get the same performance gains out of a different CPU, but specifically comparing these two, I think it's a better choice to go 3700X plus an extra 16 gigs of RAM versus grabbing the 3800X, unless you got a deal like I did, which the 3800X cost exactly the same as the 3700X. It was actually a good deal for me, and if you can find the same one, go ahead. If not, stick with that 3700. So I know I threw a lot out there, and we probably went over this pretty quick, but I'll keep it pretty simple to wrap up. Were these tests perfect? No. I don't think they were perfect. I think they were real world tests versus what you will get in your own office at your own PC setup. When you fire up Call of Duty and you run the tests, is this what you're gonna get? More than likely. I'm not going in and doing all this overclocking and dialing in my DRAM settings. I'm not overvolting, undervolting. I'm not doing any crazy liquid nitrogen cooled builds for you guys to just check out and geek out on. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to use this PC how I would every day. I fire it up, I update the game I want to play, I play it. I build out the video that I'm editing, and then I render it. That's how most of us use our PC. We don't spend hours and hours fine-tuning every little last piece of that PC before we jump on the game that we want to play. I think we showed exactly what I wanted to show, which is comparing 2019 to 2020. So far, what we know is if you buy current generation, it's not really going to matter, at least in these particular components, which one you go with. You might see a 3% increase for one particular area, but you might lose 3% in another. So AMD versus Nvidia, which would I choose? It's hard to say. If I had to build the perfect PC based on these benchmarks, how would I do it? Well, I would definitely go heavier on the RAM. 32 gigs of RAM, hands down, which leads me to buy the 3700X. Now, deciding between the 2070 Super and the 5700 XT, I'm gonna go 2070 Super. It actually shocked me how well the 2070 Super performed, and even though Userbenchmarks did say I was getting underperformance values on my 5700 XT, I feel like I could do more with that 2070 Super, and it ran really well. Now, before all of you guys comment and say, ha, Nvidia wins, I wanna let you know something. I wanna let you in on a little secret. So, I made that 2020 build about a week or two ago, right? I spent the first 3 days benchmarking and making sure that everything was stable on that build, ready to go. Well, about a week in, after playing some games, I got a blue screen of death. And it was specifically referenced to the Nvidia GPU, the 2070 Super. If you don't believe me, Gamers Nexus has an awesome video on DOA 2070 Super models and how they're affected, why you get that BSOD. And I'll put it in the link below so you guys can check that out. I'm gonna rewind a little bit and say that I also had some friends telling me, do not go with AMD. Whatever you do, the failure rate is high and they're very problematic. Well, I had to replace that 2070 Super a week in, brand new 2070 Super, and I've never had to do that with my 5700 XT. Sure, I might have struggled with some driver issues and DX12 support in the very, very early launches. I was one of the first people to get a card on the 5700 XT AIB cards, but I've never had to replace it. I've never got a blue screen of death from that graphics card, and it performs just as well. So I don't think I can say I would go either way. It depends on the build and who I was building it for. So what did we really learn? We learned that the 3800X is probably not the best CPU to buy, and you should probably stick with the 3700X and grab yourself an extra 16 gigs of RAM. Now, we learned in Borderlands 3, which is an AMD favored game, AMD does take the cake. But we kind of solidified everything we already know, which is depending on the game, you're gonna get better performance from one or the other. And not every single scenario is going to be a 1-2 knockout from either one. It didn't happen. I don't think it would happen with anybody. I'm actually kind of glad it didn't, because it keeps both of them, Nvidia and AMD, fighting each other so we get the better price and the better hardware. My conclusion to the initial question I asked, which is, if you built a PC in 2019 using the current generation, say mid-year, and you spent about $1,700, maybe you made some upgrades along the way, or you got a PC similar to the one the AMD build. If you have one of the Nvidia Super cards or the 5700 XT, chances are you probably don't need to upgrade at all. You might be looking at something that's a higher tier. Now, that's a different question altogether. But if your budget was $1,700 in 2019 and it's $1,700 in 2020, you're not really getting that much of a performance increase for you to go spend another $1,700. I definitely appreciate you guys taking the time to watch this video, and please, if you've made it this far, hit the like button, definitely subscribe, share it with all your friends so they can check out what we're doing here. And as always, you guys, I will catch you in the next video.